Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Brodsky at the Food and Drug Administration, and welcome to today's webinar about promoting the safe and effective use of prescription drugs in geriatric patients. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will define geriatric patients as those patients who are 65 years of age and older. Here is my disclaimer. I should note that photographs in this presentation are from a CDC document that's entitled The State of Aging and Health in America 2013. So there are 4 parts of this webinar. In the first part, I'll discuss a history of FDA's initiatives to increase not only the quantity, but the quality of information about the use of prescription drugs in geriatric patients. The second part of the webinar, my colleague, Dr. Singh at the Food and Drug Administration, will discuss including older adults in clinical studies, specifically the importance of including those 75 years of age and older. The third part of the webinar will discuss how to include geriatric use information in labeling in a consistent way so that healthcare practitioners can use prescription drugs safely and effectively. And finally, in part 4, I'll discuss prescription drug labeling resources. We have a one-stop shop for prescription drug labeling resources that includes resources on the prescribing information, carton container labeling, as well as patient labeling. So part 1, history of FDA's geriatric clinical data initiatives for human prescription drugs. So during this part, we'll discuss the geriatric population in the United States. And to remind everyone, for the purposes of this webinar, we're defining geriatric patients as those 65 years of age and older. Secondly, we'll provide an overview of the history of FDA's geriatric clinical data initiatives. So let's talk about the increasing number of geriatric patients in the United States, as well as polypharmacy in geriatric patients. So the geriatric population in the United States is increasing. So in 1950, approximately 8% of the population were 65 years of age and older. In 2010, according to the census, 40 million Americans were 65 years of age or older. That represented 13% of the population. Currently, it's estimated about 16% of the population is 65 years of age or older. The estimates in 2030, there'll be about 72 million Americans who are geriatric, and that will represent about 20% of the population. Now, why is that? According to the CDC, some reasons include that people are living longer. That has to do with lots of things, such as prescription drugs, anti-infectives, and also the baby boomers are increasing. I should also mention one thing too, that it's also estimated that in 2030, about 1 billion people in the world will be over 65 years of age or older. So when you prescribe a drug to geriatric patients, what are some of the considerations? Geriatric patients frequently have more comorbidities than younger adults. Geriatric patients may have decreased organ function, such as renal impairment, potentially even hepatic impairment. Geriatric patients may have more consequences of adverse reactions, more morbidity than younger patients. And as we know, there are differences in safety and effectiveness of prescription drugs in geriatric patients and younger adults. And geriatric patients also are more likely to have polypharmacy, take more concurrent therapy. So polypharmacy in geriatric patients. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'll define polypharmacy as taking 5 or more prescription drugs concurrently. So in one prospective cohort of outpatients, mean age was 71, range of ages was 62 to 85 years old. The percentage of patients in this cohort, 36% were taking 5 or more prescription drugs. Additionally, in a Medicare cohort, approximately 50% of patients were taking 5 or more drugs. So let's turn our attention to the history of FDA's geriatric clinical study initiative. So in the 1980s, FDA began several initiatives, as I said earlier, not only to increase the quantity, but increase the quality of information about the use of prescription drugs in geriatric patients. And this is so it will help healthcare practitioners use these prescription drugs in geriatric patients. So in 1998, FDA required new drug application or NDA holders of drug products and later recommended that BLA holders or biologic license application holders for biological products present safety and efficacy data based upon age in their applications. So what does that mean? Essentially, we required people to analyze the data in geriatric patients versus younger patients. So if you analyze information, then we'll learn more if geriatric patients have different responses than younger patients. Subsequently, in 2012, FDA restated that it was very important to obtain geriatric patients across the entire geriatric population, particularly in those who are 75 years of age and older due to a higher incidence of comorbidities. So additionally, in 2012, FDASIA, which is a statute, a law passed by Congress, it's named the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act. So it required FDA to report on the inclusion of age subgroups in clinical studies, as well as analyze these subgroups in applications. So how is industry, how are applications doing? How are they doing in including geriatric patients in studies, and how are they doing in analyzing these data? Subsequently, in 2013, FDA published a document called Good Review Practice Document. So this is a document for staff at the FDA and how we review investigational new drug applications. So one of the key messages here was to discourage applicants or sponsors to have an arbitrary upper age limit to enter a trial. So if you don't restrict geriatric patients, as long as it's safe to not to restrict them, to include them in the study, we'll obtain more data on geriatric patients. So in response to Congress's requirements in 2012, the first thing FDA did is to ask how is it going? How is industry doing? How is the FDA doing? How are we collecting, analyzing data about geriatric patients, particularly subgroup analyses, and how is this information available to the public? So what FDA did is we looked at all approved novel products in the year 2011. That included 72 novel drugs, prescription biological products, and devices. Of the 72, there were 35 novel prescription drugs and biological products. And I want to concentrate on the drugs in this presentation. So what we found, at least in the 2011 cohort, is that the percentage of patients who are geriatric in the clinical studies seem to reflect the disease prevalence in geriatric patients. And I can give you some examples of that. So in this year, in 2011, drugs were approved for ALL, Hodgkin's disease, as well as lupus. In those diseases and conditions, typically you see a younger age group, either pediatric patients or younger adults that have the disease. So one would expect a lower incidence of geriatric patients in those trials, and you can see with the lupus drug that was approved in 2011, only 2% were 65 years of age and older, which generally reflected the prevalence of that disease. In contrast, there were some diseases that occur more likely in older Americans. Specifically, in 2011, we approved a drug for age-related macular degeneration, and in these key studies, 80% were greater or equal to 65 years of age and older. So one key thing is to look at the prevalence of the disease, prevalence of geriatric patients. I'll restate, prevalence of the disease in geriatric patients. Next, in 2014, with the data that we collected from the 2013 report, we did an action plan. So overall, we concluded we're doing well. However, we said that we could do better. We could work with stakeholders to do even better. And some of the action were laid out were to improve the quality of demographic subgroup collection, reporting, and analysis, as well as making demographic subgroup more available and transparent. And I'm going to concentrate on geriatrics for this particular webinar. So two of the ways that we made this information more transparent are drug trial snapshots, which we started publishing in 2015, and the draft geriatric labeling guidance, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, that provides FDA's recommendations about how we can consistently communicate geriatric use information in labeling. In 2019, we published a draft guidance about FDA's enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. So in this guidance, we provided recommended approaches on how sponsors can broaden their eligibility criteria without compromising safety. And in this guidance, we emphasized not to have an arbitrary age cutoff. If you don't have an arbitrary age cutoff for your trials, then you'll broaden your eligibility and you'll collect more data on geriatric patients, and you'll have a better understanding about how that drug works in geriatric patients. So turning our attention to drug trials snapshots, as I said earlier, it started in 2015. Since that time, we've published data on all CDER's new molecular entities and new biological products. And this is for demographic groups, including geriatric patients and younger adults who participated in the key clinical trials. Not all the trials. So typically, these are the phase 3 trials. Typically, we did not include phase 1 or phase 2 trials in these analyses. In addition to analyzing who was in the trials, it included subgroup analyses based upon demographic groups, including age, for example, subgroup analyses in safety and efficacy in geriatric patients compared to younger adults. So here's an example of a part of a drug trial snapshot for a product that was approved within the last year. This figure shows the percentage of patients in the key clinical trials that supported approval of this product that were 65 years of age and older, or less than 65 years of age. I should note that drug trial snapshots are not updated after the drug is approved. So, for example, if a drug has subsequently approved several other indications, the data from drug trial snapshots is not updated. So here is a figure, and let me walk through it. There's a lot of data to this figure. This presents drug trial snapshots. It's the percentage of geriatric patients in new molecular entity and new biological product drug trials in CDER. So the first column presents the year, all the NMEs and new biological products that were approved that year. That's in the second column in CDER. The third column describes the total number of patients in the key clinical studies that supported the approval. And the last column gives the percentage of patients who are 65 years of age and older. As I stated earlier, approximately 16% of patients in the United States are 65 years of age and older. So then at first glance, you say, wow, these trials have a higher percentage of patients than the U.S. population. However, you would have to stop there because, again, as I said earlier, it really depends upon what type of diseases and conditions were approved during this year. So, for example, during these years, FDA basically approved drugs for acne, sickle cell disease, postpartum depression, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Those are diseases and conditions that occur mostly either in pediatric patients or younger adults. So one would not expect a high percentage of geriatric patients in those studies. However, also in these 5 years, we approved drugs for osteoporosis and multiple myeloma. So one would expect a very large percentage of patients who are geriatric in this study. So it really depends upon the types of disease and conditions we're talking about. So before I end part 1 of this webinar, I have one challenge question for you. So for this challenge question, I'll read the question and each of the answers. Then I'll pause for a few seconds and let you think about the answer. Finally, I'll walk you through the answers. Which of the following is not true about FDA's drug trials snapshots? Answer 1 includes subgroup efficacy data by age groups. Answer 2 includes subgroup safety data by age groups. Answer 3 includes updated geriatric data from trials completed after approval. Answer 4 includes the percentage of geriatric patients in key clinical trials. Great. The answer to this question is answer 3. That's not true. So, as I stated earlier, drug trials snapshots includes key data, typically the phase 3 trials, that supported approval of the product at the time of approval. Drug trial snapshot is not updated with subsequent data. Answers 1, 2, and 4 are all true. It provides the percentage of geriatric patients in the key clinical trials, as well as subgroup analyses based upon safety and efficacy in geriatric patients compared to younger adult patients. So this concludes part 1 of the webinar. I would like to introduce my colleague at the FDA, Dr. Harpreet Singh. Actually has 2 roles at the FDA. She's the Director of the Division of Oncology 2 in the Office of Oncologic Diseases in CDER, as well as the Acting Associate Director for Cancer in Older Adults and Special Populations at the Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA. And she will provide FDA's recommendations for including geriatric patients in clinical trials to treat cancer. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of today's webinar. I'm Harpreet Singh, Director of the Division of Oncology 2 in the Office of Oncologic Diseases and Acting Associate Director for Cancer in Older Adults and Special Populations. This part of the webinar will focus on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent an official FDA position. Let's start by setting the stage and discussing the estimated cancer prevalence by age in the United States. We are expecting a rise in cancer prevalence as cancer is a disease associated with aging. The blue line represents the year which the first baby boomers turned 65 years old. As you can see, our country is expecting a large increase in older patients, particularly those over 75. However, older adults remain underrepresented in cancer clinical trials. This figure represents an analysis which was presented at the ASCO annual meeting, ASCO is the American Society for Clinical Oncologists, in 2017. This is a 10-year perspective of clinical trials submitted to the FDA for registrational intent. The analysis included over 200,000 patients. The red bars represent the percentage of patients with a diagnosis of cancer by age based on CDER databases. The yellow bars represent percentage of patients with cancer enrolled on clinical trials by age. As you can see, patients over 65 are truly underrepresented in cancer clinical trials. However, the disparity is greatest for patients over 75. Roughly 30% of patients with cancer are over age 75. However, they make up only about 10% of clinical trial populations. This creates a gap in knowledge as clinicians do not have the evidence with which to treat their older adults with cancer. This figure represents FDA trials in hematologic malignancies and shows patients enrolled on these trials compared with new cases by age group. I will use the multiple myeloma example to demonstrate a persistent trend, which is the U-shaped curve. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, percentages of patients enrolled on clinical trials under the age of 65 is roughly 50%. However, these patients only represent less than 40% of those with new cases of multiple myeloma. On the other hand, patients over age 75 represent roughly 30% of new cases of multiple myeloma. However, only about 13% of patients in multiple myeloma clinical trials are over age 75. There is biologic rationale for inclusion of older adults with cancer on clinical trials. Pharmacokinetic considerations include intrinsic factors such as renal and hepatic function, both of which decline naturally with age. Patients who are older often have an increased number of comorbidities. Patients may be on several other therapeutics, thus extrinsic factors such as drug-drug interactions must be considered. Pharmacodynamic considerations include adverse events, desirable effects, and efficiency of compensatory mechanisms. Thus, the goal of geriatric oncology is to improve the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer and thereby improve the quality of care received by older adults with cancer. Extrapolation of data from younger patients is inadequate. Personalized medicine will require that trials address patient heterogeneity. Not only must we consider drug development in a tumor-centric manner, but importantly in a patient-centric manner. in which comorbidities, cognitive function, nutrition, and other factors all go into assessment and assessment of physical function, which may in turn impact treatment outcomes. There are opportunities for systematic change, which require multi-stakeholder engagement, leading to systematic actions in order to close the evidence gap which currently exists. Here you see a timeline which depicts the efforts to improve the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer. In 2013, the Institute of Medicine published a report delivering high-quality cancer care, charting a new course for a system in crisis. ASCO reviewed these recommendations and in turn formed an Older Adults and Research Working Group. From that working group came an ASCO research statement published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology in 2015. Subsequently, the FDA held an internal meeting with several authors of this publication to discuss ASCO's efforts to implement recommendations and the role that FDA could play. In 2017, FDA and ASCO co-sponsored a public meeting to discuss how we could improve the evidence base for treating older adults. Further efforts continue, and several of those will be discussed within the course of this talk. One of them, of course, is to include other key stakeholders such as the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute of Aging. Shown here are the key recommendations from the Journal of Clinical Oncology's research recommendations for improving the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer. Recommendations included improving the conduct of research by using clinical trials to improve the evidence for treating older adults with cancer, leveraging research designs, also improving the research environment. There were calls to increase the FDA authority to incentivize and require research involving older adults with cancer, as well as efforts to increase clinicians' recruitment of older adults. Subsequently, after the FDA and ASCO workshop in 2017, we published several action items in the form of a commentary published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. Action items included, in addition to increasing enrollment of older adults on trials, collecting more information on older adults from treatment trials, expanding the use of real-world data in research on older adults, and strengthening the collaboration between stakeholders to develop advocacy and policy solutions. Sponsors were also called to action in terms of opportunities for systematic change. First, they were asked to implement the ASCO FDA Friends of Cancer eligibility criteria recommendations, which we'll hear about in this presentation. Also, to expand access to clinical trials in community settings. There are several efforts to decentralize clinical trials. These efforts predated COVID. However, we certainly understand that COVID has provided us an opportunity to very quickly decentralize trials or create hybrid trials, and we look forward to discussing that further with sponsors and investigators. Sponsors of clinical trials were also called upon to engage social and behavioral scientists, patient advocates, geriatricians, and geriatric oncologists during the trial design phase. The efforts to translate recommendations into action were also directed at the FDA. The FDA was called upon to routinely work with sponsors during the planning process for INDs, so early in drug development, to develop oncology-specific guidance on how to increase the enrollment of older adults on trials and what data to collect, to support root cause analyses to understand the lack of physician recruitment of older adults to trials. We were asked to conduct analyses that compare recruitment in oncology clinical trials to other diseases, as well as to other parts of the world, and also to consider post-marketing commitments where appropriate to obtain more data on older adults. Several of these initiatives are part of our newly launched Project Silver, which is an initiative aimed at improving the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer via regulatory policy, advocacy and outreach, global engagement, and research and publications. The FDA has a long-standing history and interest in inclusion of older adults in clinical trials dating back to 1997, and you've heard from Dr. Brodsky about several of these guidances as well. I would like to focus on a few specific guidances that relate to patients with cancer. In 2020, Cancer Clinical Trial Eligibility Criteria Guidance on patients with organ dysfunction or prior or concurrent malignancies was finalized. This FDA guidance for industry speaks directly to patients who have organ dysfunction such as renal and hepatic dysfunction, or who have prior or concurrent malignancies and their eligibility for clinical trials. Many of these patients were excluded from clinical trials based on restrictive eligibility criteria, which may or may not have had adequate rationale. As a result, many older patients who have naturally declining renal function, for example, or who may have a low-grade prostate cancer that does not require treatment, may be excluded from trials for which they would otherwise be eligible. Seen here is a predicted enrollment of older adults when exclusion criteria are relaxed. At baseline, based on the previous eligibility criteria, only about a third of older adults would be eligible for clinical trials. When you relax organ system exclusions based on rational understanding of the drug's mechanism and expected toxicities, this number goes up to roughly 50%. And finally, when you relax functional status and organ system inclusions, more patients are eligible for enrollment of clinical trials. The following is a quote attributed to Dr. Richard Pazder, who is the director of the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. This quote was released prior to our next guidance, which we will discuss, which focuses specifically on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. I will just read the second two paragraphs in which Dr. Pazder reaffirms that unfortunately adults over 65, but particularly those over 75, remain underrepresented in cancer clinical trials, despite accounting for a growing segment of our cancer population. This has been a persistent issue, and the FDA is engaged, and that is why, as requested, we provided recommendations on exactly how to increase the enrollment of older adults in cancer clinical trials. In March of this year, of 2020, the FDA, and particularly the Oncology Center of Excellence, released in draft form a guidance document on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. We highlight that adequate representation of older adults is necessary to determine the benefit-risk of cancer therapeutics in this population. The guidance is divided into 3 sections. We talk about early clinical development and how it is important to enroll older adults in early phase trials. Of course, the clinical trial phase, we discuss trial design, recruitment strategies, how to report data, and importantly, how it may be important to collect post-marketing data on older adults through additional trials, registries, and/or real-world data. The general recommendations including a representative population. The strategy for how to include older adults may be informed by the prevalence of the condition. For example, breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and multiple myeloma are all diseases in oncology in which older adults, particularly those over 75, require additional data and tend to be underrepresented on clinical trials. Understanding prior relevant studies, as well as expected differences and safety and efficacy outcomes, may also inform strategies for inclusion. In early clinical development, it is important to evaluate drug-drug interactions early and also to make sure that older adults are enrolled in early phase studies to help inform dose selection. The FDA was asked to evaluate the age demographics of early phase clinical trials in response to this guidance via public comment, and this is something we are currently undertaking. For clinical trials with registrational intent, we ask that sponsors and investigators come and talk to us early as they are designing their trial. Consider flexible approaches to trial design, and consider patient perspectives, including endpoints. Recruitment strategies may include geography of clinical trial sites. We know that many clinical trials are conducted in areas of the country in which there are not necessarily older adults in high concentrations. How the informational material is presented. Also, clinical trials should accommodate need for impairments such as hearing and visual impairments. Considering giving support to patient caregivers may also be of value. Discussing specific goals for enrollment with trial investigators to promote them ensuring a diverse and representative clinical trial population is also of value. We also suggest that you consider recruiting investigators who have expertise in the care of older adults with cancer. Clinical trial assessments and reporting is also a topic discussed in the guidance. We recommend collecting information on various elements from the geriatric assessment tools if feasible, mostly those that assess functional status. It is also of value to develop and report data in more discrete age groups because no longer is the age cutoff of over 65 adequate or informative to describe older adults. We are aiming to include more detailed information in the geriatric use section, such as the example seen below, in which data on patients over 65 and over 75 is included in the geriatric use section of the label. In terms of post-market considerations, ideally adequate information on older adults should be captured in the pre-market trials. However, if older adults are not adequately represented, it may be appropriate to develop a plan to collect data on older adults in the post-market setting. This could be accomplished with post-marketing trials examining a broader population or through collection of real-world data in an observational study or registry. In certain situations, the FDA may require post-market studies and/or clinical trials. Sponsors and investigators should prospectively discuss their plan for collecting additional information in the post-market setting with the CDER or CDER review division or office. Post-market data can provide clinically useful information and, when appropriate, could be added to the geriatric use section of the label. Here is another example of geriatric use labeling in which, per 21 CFR, specific statements on geriatric use of drug for an indication approved for adults must be contained in the geriatric use subsection. Here is another example of a drug label in bladder cancer, again, where we made an effort to show data for patients both over 65 as well as those over 75. Certainly in bladder cancer, this is particularly relevant. There is also a great deal of data and literature on conducting geriatric assessments, and this article, published in 2018 in the Journal of Clinical Oncology in the practical assessment and management of vulnerabilities in older adults receiving chemotherapy, included 4 key take-home messages, the first of which was to actually conduct geriatric assessments, including assessment of functional status. This will also include essential geriatric assessment domains, and to conduct non-cancer prognostication based on comorbidities. Finally, to enact a geriatric assessment guided targeted intervention. This could include, as an example, an assessment of a patient who may be at high risk for falls, to refer them to physical therapy or occupational therapy in order to mitigate their risk of falls and fractures. I will now move to the global regulatory strategy portion of Project Silver. Some of this was presented at ASCO 2020 this year in a session on globalization of geriatric oncology. As we all know, oncology drug development is global. Pivotal trials are international, and older adults are a growing segment of our global population of patients with cancer. As you know, regardless of where the trial is conducted, these patients do remain underrepresented in oncology trials. Therefore, we need global regulatory strategies to increase the evidence. This is an analysis of 10 years of clinical trials based on global enrollment of older adults. Over 170,000 patients were included in this analysis, and what we see here is that most of the patients over age 65 enrolled on clinical trials are in Europe, with a roughly 50%. This is followed by patients in the US and Canada at about 30%, and then very few patients in Asia and Latin America. There are several global geriatric oncology initiatives around the world because of the increasing numbers of older adults with cancer in oncology clinics. Certainly, the US has dedicated geriatric oncology clinics as well as training fellowships and several active research initiatives, many of which are here at the FDA. Europe has a very mature and robust geriatric oncology program. They have national guidelines with the EMA, as well as collaborative multinational groups. In Asia, we have high-income countries which have dedicated geriatric clinics. However, in the low and middle-income countries, we are also starting to see public policy initiatives addressing this issue. In Latin America, we are starting to see multidisciplinary geriatric oncology clinics in Brazil and Mexico. And similarly, we are seeing these clinics in Australia, with the Australian Clinical Oncology Society initiating active geriatric oncology programs. And so the global outreach portion of Project Silver is intended to have a comprehensive global regulatory effort. This way, we are identifying liaisons through Project Orbis, which is a global regulatory review tool that we have in the Oncology Center of Excellence for Project Silver. So we're basically leveraging one of our global regulatory programs in which we discuss applications to broaden that to discuss key applications in specific disease areas with other regulatory agencies, those that heavily impact older adults. Together, in our joined reviews, we will consider more detailed labeling information and think about post-marketing data in the applications that we review jointly. In November of 2019, the International Society for Geriatric Oncology had the opportunity to present to the United Nations on meeting the needs of older cancer patients around the world. No talk is complete without a mention of COVID, and I will explain why this is relevant, but before I do, let me just highlight our COVID guidance on conduct of clinical trials and medical products during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was initially released in March and has had several updates since then. The COVID guidances are all expedited and released without public comment. This is unlike traditional FDA guidances, which go through a period of public comment and several months and sometimes up to a year of internal clearance processes. These were the considerations highlighted in the guidance for ongoing trials. First, safety was paramount, so all modifications to trials in the COVID era should assure patient safety. We asked that investigators and sponsors engage with the IRB on continued accrual, drug administration, and trial participation. Alternative off-site methods for safety assessments and site monitoring were encouraged. Alternative secure delivery of investigational product could also be explored. The guidance also clarifies reporting requirements as well as interactions with FDA and IRBs. Some could be reported after protocol modifications were made. What are some of the barriers to clinical trial participation, particularly for older adults? So one of the major ones, as I mentioned earlier, is geographic and logistical barriers. Clinical trials are often not conducted where older adults live. An example of that is rural parts of the country. Even if the clinical trial site is local, older adults often require assistance in getting to their appointments. Clinical trials typically require more healthcare interactions than standard of care. Furthermore, caregiver support is often required for transportation and for advocacy. There is also a desire, based on studies, one of them is listed here at the bottom of the slide, that older adults have for treatment with their home physician, someone who is familiar to them. There may be a preference for their known community-based physician. Several elements of decentralized trials, which were discussed in the COVID guidance, may address some of these current barriers. So, for example, the idea that you could obtain local labs and imaging for safety assessments and monitoring may mitigate some concerns with travel. Furthermore, telemedicine visits by phone or video, although we do have to bear in mind visual and hearing impairments, which may be more common in older adults. Nevertheless, this type of technology could facilitate remote data collection and monitoring, again addressing the barrier of actually getting to the clinical trial site. Shipping oral drugs and even administering IV drugs locally where feasible also are elements of decentralization or a hybrid approach to clinical trials, which may address some of the barriers that currently exist. So there are potential silver linings from this pandemic. Again, the calls to make clinical trials more patient-centered predated COVID-19, and the FDA's efforts in support of decentralization of trials are long-standing. However, certainly the pandemic put everything into a very accelerated pace in terms of very quickly decentralizing or hybridizing trials in order to keep patients safe. I do think and hope that post-COVID-19, some of these modifications to trials will continue, such as bringing trial assessments to where patients live and taking advantage of digital health technology, learning from real-world data, and particularly we know that older adults have been heavily impacted by COVID-19. Much of this data is being studied within the COVID-19 Evidence Accelerator, which is an effort by the Reagan-Udall Foundation and Friends of Cancer Research to really leverage real-world data to understand COVID-19 as well as devices and therapeutics. I do think that learning from this experience will have a positive impact on how we think about enrolling more older adults onto cancer clinical trials. Much of this has been discussed, for example, at national workshops. For example, in August, the Drug Research and Development for Adults Across the Older Age span featured a Lessons Learned from COVID-19 session. In January of 2021, the National Academies is hosting another workshop, a public workshop on exploring root causes and bridging the knowledge gap on older adults with cancer. So I encourage you all to attend. And finally, I just want to highlight one of our aspects of Project Silver, which is research and publications, which is part of the ASCO recommendations for how the FDA can engage. And as you know, we have an immense amount of data as well as regulatory thought. And so as you can see here, these are several of our publications over the last few years, some of which are FDA perspectives on policy and how to enroll more older adults on clinical trials, while others are actual analyses of data, such as pooled analyses of outcomes of older women with hormone receptor positive breast cancer in patients treated with a CDK4/6 inhibitor. So these are just some of the academic publications that we think are important to publish in journals and disseminate widely. And with that, I would like to thank the audience for their attention, and please feel free to reach out to me with questions. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Eric Brodsky again from the Food and Drug Administration. Today, or right now, we're going to discuss part 3 of 4 of the webinar. And in this discussion, we're going to talk about incorporating geriatric use information into prescription drug labeling. Here is my disclaimer. It's the same as the one before. So we are going to discuss during part 3 the draft guidance for industry entitled Geriatric Information in Human Prescription Drug and Biological Product Labeling. This guidance was published in draft about 2 months ago in September 2020. And during this webinar, I'll refer to the guidance as the Geriatric Labeling Draft Guidance. So the learning objectives is to discuss how to incorporate geriatric use information into the prescribing information, essentially what sections and or subsections geriatric use information should appear. As well, we will discuss omitting, revising, and or updating geriatric use information in the prescribing information. Here is a picture of the first page of the guidance. So the key concept in the guidance is to assist applicants regarding the most appropriate placement of including geriatric use information in labeling. This guidance replaces a guidance entitled Content and Format for Geriatric Labeling, which was published in October 2001. So nearly 2 decades ago, we published the first guidance on geriatric labeling, and 2 decades later, we published this new guidance. So in an earlier talk, I talked about for the purposes of prescription drug labeling, we define geriatric patients as those 65 years of age and older. So how did this come about? So we had a draft geriatric labeling rule published in 1990. This rule was finalized in 1997 and became effective in 1998. But when we were finalizing this rule, we received a lot of suggestions for age designations. So some folks thought the age designation should be lower than 65. Some people thought it should be age 60. There was one comment that it should be age 50. In contrast, there were other comments that thought it should be higher, age 80. And then there were other comments that stated that an age would not be the most appropriate way to define these groups, and suggested instead to look at functionality, organ functionality, or body composition. So during the rule, when we finalized the rule, we recognized that it is challenging to assign a certain age, and potentially an age may not be appropriate in all situations. However, for the purposes of uniformity, we kept age 65 years of age and older to ensure healthcare practitioners, when they see geriatric use, it means the same thing for all prescription drug labeling, and also for application holders when they analyze data, when they collect data and analyze data, we're using similar age groups. However, the rule noted that if application holders could propose a different age if it was appropriate for their prescription drug. So there were also comments about age cutoffs, that we shouldn't just be analyzing those geriatric patients and younger adults, those who are less than 65 years of age and older, because there may be differences in different geriatric subpopulations. For example, there may be differences in safety and effectiveness in a 66-year-old compared to a 90-year-old patient. We recognize this, and we stated that one can use additional subgroups within the geriatric population to analyze efficacy and or safety, such as age 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 85 years in age and old. So moving on to the geriatric labeling draft guidance, it presents three scenarios. So first, which is by far the most common scenario, a product is approved for use in adult patients, which includes geriatric patients, and that's really the entire focus of today's discussion, because that's by far the most common example. There's also a situation that's very uncommon. It's a situation, according to the regulations, it's a geriatric specific indication is defined as for a specific indication. A drug is indicated only for use in geriatric patients and not in younger adult patients. And thirdly, the guidance discusses another situation which is also uncommon. So a drug is not approved in geriatric patients, but it's approved in younger adults. It's kind of the flip of the second situation. But again, that's not common, and we will not discuss that in the bulk of the presentation today. So, as stated earlier, we're going to discuss throughout this presentation when a drug is approved for use in adult patients, which includes geriatric patients. So on the left, I put the sections of the prescribing information. If you include a box warning, there are 18 sections of labeling. So the geriatric use subsection was actually created in 1997, recognized our old format regulations or non-physician labeling rule format regulations that came out in 1979 did not have a dedicated geriatric use subsection. And this subsection geriatric use was created in 1997 and became effective in 1998. So although prescription drug labeling has been around for 40 years, the geriatric use subsection has only been around from a regulatory standpoint for about 20 years. So I think of the geriatric use subsection as the home section for all important geriatric use information. So this potentially will help geriatricians if they want to know specific information about how to use their products safely and effectively. So geriatric exposure data in the geriatric use subsection. So for a consistent approach across all labeling, we recommend, in general, that geriatric exposure data appear first. There are certain exceptions for this. Potentially, if you have certain risk mitigation that you want to tell folks right away, that's a situation where you may want to discuss that first. Potentially dose adjustments or specific monitoring, that's really important to say. But besides that, our general recommendation is to include exposure information for a consistent approach across all physician labeling rule labeling. So geriatric exposure data is only required in one situation according to the regulations. So this is a situation when it was sufficient to detect differences in safety and effectiveness between geriatric patients and younger adult patients. And we didn't see anything. There was we didn't see any observed differences in safety and or effectiveness. Now, in this situation, one could either, according to the regulations, include the percentage of patients who were 65 years of age and older, as well as the percentage of patients 75 years of age and older, or you could include the number of patients. However, according to the guidance, we recommend providing both pieces of information because we want healthcare practitioners to know as much information about how many geriatric patients were exposed in your specific set of clinical studies. In all other situations, potentially when it was insufficient to detect differences, or it was sufficient to detect differences and we saw differences, we want to also provide geriatric exposure information. As I stated earlier, we can use alternative age cutoffs besides less than 65 and greater than 65. However, one would need to provide a rationale and submit that to the FDA for consideration. So here are some examples of geriatric exposure data in the geriatric use subsection. Again, the geriatric use subsection is subsection 8.5. It's in the use in specific populations section of PLR labeling. So here I'll put all these situations out for you. These are some examples. Notice in every single example, we include not only the number, but the percentage of patients in each of the groups. These examples differ based upon cutoffs. There's one example that there's a cutoff of age 65 years of age and older and age 75 years of age and older. There's another cutoff looking at those 65 to 74 and then those 75 and above. And there's another cutoff that breaks it down even more. In addition to that, one could also include, not only do we want the drug-treated exposure, but you could also, if you want, include drug and control-treated exposure. Those in all the pertinent studies who were 65 years of age and older. So we develop the regulations and also the guidance talks about how to include information. And one of the key features is it sufficient? Do we have enough data to determine if we can detect differences in safety and or efficacy or effectiveness between geriatric patients and younger adult patients? And so one situation is that we don't have enough information to detect if there's differences between geriatric and younger adult patients. And the second scenario is there's sufficient information. There's adequate information. And there's two subcategories. One is if we have sufficient information, we saw something, we saw differences. And the other one is there's sufficient information, but we didn't see any differences. And we want to tell healthcare practitioners about that. So let's go with the first scenario. There's insufficient information. There's not enough data to determine if there are differences in response, safety, and effectiveness between geriatric patients and those less than 65 years of age. And this is all, again, in subsection 8.5, the geriatric use subsection. So in the scenario, this is the required regulatory statement. I should note, as I stated before, if another statement, an alternative statement that is accurate can be used if the current regulatory statement is potentially inapplicable. So for example, if you have a product and there's only one recommended dose, there's some aspects of the statement that's not applicable. And sometimes we don't have other reported clinical experience. And we generally define that as observational study data, case reports, spontaneous adverse reaction data. So sometimes it's a new molecular entity and we don't have that. So this would be an example of an alternative statement if all those things I stated were true. It's a slightly abbreviated statement that one can use in this situation. Again, there's insufficient information to detect differences in safety and effectiveness between geriatric patients and younger adult patients. So let's go on to the next scenario. So this is a situation where there is insufficient information to detect differences. However, we just don't have enough data. And the reason is because the condition or disease occurs primarily in pediatric patients or younger adults. So what are some examples of this? So Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, acne, atopic dermatitis, bacterial vaginosis, cystic fibrosis, prevention of pregnancy, Fabry's disease, endometriosis. In those diseases, we generally have no geriatric exposure or very little geriatric exposure. So in this case, frequently, we don't have any reason to exclude geriatric patients from the indication because sometimes there are geriatric patients that have some of these indications. So we don't narrow the indication. However, we include a statement that you could consider including the statement in the geriatric use subsection, such as the disease is largely a disease of pediatric and young adult patients, and studies did not include patients who are 65 years of age and older. Again, this is a situation that the disease or condition primarily occurs in pediatric patients and or younger adults. So let's turn to a different scenario. Now you have enough data and you basically have sufficient information to detect differences between safety and effectiveness between geriatric patients and younger adults. So in one part of it is that we didn't see anything. We didn't see any observed differences between geriatric patients and younger adults. So in this situation, the first bullet represents the required regulatory statement to include. However, the guidance states one could include an alternative statement if it's accurate and appropriate. So one example may be that in these patients, there may not be a greater sensitivity of some older folks because there's a very wide therapeutic index. You can go up much higher on the dose of the dosage, and you're not really seeing greater sensitivity in older folks. So you want in this situation, one could potentially use the alternative statement, and that's represented in the second bullet. So here is another scenario. Again, there's sufficient data to detect differences. However, we observe differences in safety and effectiveness. So in this situation, you must tell people what were those differences between geriatric patients and younger patients. Was it reduced effectiveness? Did we see some unique adverse reactions in geriatric patients compared to younger adult patients? Did we see a higher incidence or greater rate of adverse reactions, or were there more severe in geriatric patients compared to younger adults? And again, we're talking about the geriatric use subsection 8.5. So again, if we did see differences, what's the risk mitigation? We must include specific monitoring information if we have that, and dosage recommendations. So here's an example where there is sufficient information and we saw differences in effectiveness between geriatric patients compared to younger adults. So in this example, placebo-treated patients had the same response, 10%, in all three geriatric subpopulations, those less than 65, those 65 to 75, and those 75 years of age and older. So there's no difference in placebo-treated patients, which would suggest that there's no potentially age-related differences in the disease in terms of the response. However, let's look at the drug-treated group. In the drug-treated group, there was lower response with increasing age. And that is presented in the first sentence of this example. So here's another example of, again, observed differences in effectiveness in geriatric patients. And in this example, we're pointing out that there were no differences in safety. So sometimes you have differences in effectiveness, but there was no differences in safety. So we point out there's no overall differences in safety. And then we describe the differences in effectiveness. So in this fictitious example, this is an example for non-small cell lung cancer. And patients had, in terms of survival, there was benefit of taking the drug. And it seemed to be that those less than 65 responded slightly better than those who were over 65. So if you look at the hazard ratio, it was 0.6.1, slightly better. Lower is better in this situation. It was better in those less than 65 compared to 0.73 in those greater than 65. Now, in this fictitious example, it works in geriatric patients. It just works slightly. There's a suggestion that it works slightly less than those less than 65 years of age and old. Now, here is an example where there's observed differences in safety in geriatric patients compared to those less than 65. In this example, let's again look at the placebo rates. It was between 1 to 3% that patients in the placebo group had nausea and vomiting, irrespective of the geriatric subpopulation. but looking at the geriatric population in the drug-treated group as we got older, 65 to 75, and then 75 years of age and older, there was a higher incidence of nausea and vomiting. And that's something really important to point out in the geriatric use subsection, possibly other sections of the labeling. Here's another example where we see observed differences in safety, but no differences in effectiveness. So again, you could split effectiveness from safety. Here is an example of some differences in safety. In this situation, there was a higher incidence of serious adverse reactions overall in geriatric patients compared to those less than 65. And the second sentence describes in detail what those serious adverse reactions were. Again, you could split efficacy and safety if that's the case with your prescription drug. So one question that comes to mind, do we pool studies or do we not pool studies in the geriatric use subsection? And the answer is it depends upon the situation. So this is a situation where it was not appropriate to pool. So we take, let's say a product's approved for disease A, to treat disease A, and to treat disease B. In the first scenario, we have enough data and enough confidence in the data that to see that we didn't see a difference in safety and or efficacy in those geriatric patients and younger adult patients. But in disease B, we didn't have enough information. So again, you see a different regulatory statement according to the disease, depending upon lots of different factors. Here's an example where you pool data from studies. And here, you didn't see any differences in safety and or effectiveness. There are many different situations. One would be you include exposure data and analysis based upon individual studies. You may pool all studies in a disease, or potentially you could pool studies across many different diseases. So there's additional information also to include in the geriatric use subsection. So if there are specific risks or safety concerns, then that information must be in the geriatric use subsection. And if there's specific monitoring, that information must be in the geriatric use subsection. As I stated earlier, one generally includes the exposure information first in the geriatric use subsection. However, one can include the risk mitigation information. So before the exposure. So in this situation, the first thing that you see is assess renal function more frequently in geriatric treated patients, and you give the reason why. And then another part of the risk mitigation is that there's a dosage reduction in geriatric patients. And we refer to section 2 for the details of that recommended dosage in geriatric patients. Subsequently, one includes the exposure statement, and then one can include additional required and or recommended information in the geriatric use subsection. So with respect to pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic results, if there are dedicated studies in geriatric patients, one must summarize the information in subsection 8.5, the geriatric use subsection, and then one must describe in detail the results of these studies in the clinical pharmacology section, specifically in the pharmacokinetic subsection, that's subsection 12.3. So as an example for that, here's an example of a situation where there is higher exposure in geriatric patients compared to younger adults, and that increases the risk of adverse reactions, and therefore the dosage is recommended to be reduced. The general statement about dosage is here, that we want a lower dosage, but the specific dosage recommendation, again, is in section 2, dosage and administration. So sometimes we do have dedicated studies in geriatric patients, which is fantastic. And in general, one would consider summarizing the dedicated studies in the geriatric use subsection. It's kind of analogous to the pediatric use subsection, where we do have a summary of the basis of approval, and frequently we summarize dedicated pediatric studies. So in the geriatric use subsection, we would summarize the results of the studies and a description of the studies, but the details of the studies must be included in section 14, the clinical studies section of labeling. So how do we incorporate? We talked a lot about including geriatric use information in subsection 8.5, the geriatric use subsection. How do we incorporate this information in other sections of labeling? So in the dosage administration section of labeling, typically the recommended dosage in geriatric patients is the same as the recommended dosage in the general adult population, and usually there's not information here. However, if there is a different dosage recommendation in geriatric patients, it must be in section 2. It must be in the dosage administration section. Warnings and precautions. If there are no differences in clinically significant adverse reactions or risks, one would not generally include information about geriatric use in section 5, warnings and precautions. However, if there are unique risks, specifically clinically significant risks or adverse reactions, one must include these unique risks and or adverse reactions in section 5. And generally, we should include clinically significant adverse reactions or risks that occur at a greater severity or frequency in geriatric patients compared to younger adults. So other sections of labeling, continuing. So the adverse reaction section. So if there are no differences in frequency, severity, or the type of adverse reactions in geriatric patients compared to younger adult patients, it's generally not necessary to separately present adverse reaction data from geriatric patients in section 6, the adverse reaction section. However, if there are differences in frequency, severity, or the type of adverse reaction in geriatric patients compared to younger adults, it should be included in section 6. Additionally, if there are unique adverse reactions that occur in geriatric patients, it should also be included in the adverse reaction section. Clinical pharmacology, as I stated earlier, if there are dedicated studies in PK, pharmacokinetic, and or pharmacodynamic studies, the details must be in the clinical pharmacology section of labeling. If appropriate and relevant, we would also include pharmacogenomic data in geriatric patients, data from population analyses, and dose response information. So the clinical study section of labeling, which is consistent with other, this is from our clinical study section of labeling guidance, that one includes not only a description of the study, but the results of the study that provide a substantial evidence of effectiveness for the use. So if we have dedicated geriatric studies, one should include a description of results of those studies in section 14. If we have studies in adults which include geriatric patients, we should also include a description of the studies as well as the results in section 14, the clinical studies section of labeling. So omitting, revising, and or updating geriatric use information. So, as I stated earlier, application holders may propose omitting specific requirement or specific information, or may propose altering certain required language. Applicants, if they want to do this, they can provide a rationale for this. For example, one may also omit the entire section, or subsection, I should say, the geriatric use subsection, if the information is clearly inapplicable. For example, if a product is approved only in neonates and it is not used in geriatric patients, the information is generally, the subsection, geriatric use, is generally inapplicable. So in that scenario, one could remove the geriatric use subsection. As I stated earlier, FDA can permit omitting a statement or a required information, or removing the section if appropriate. Sometimes we see statements in the geriatric use subsection that doesn't describe the effect of the drug in a geriatric population. So, for example, we've seen such a statement in the geriatric use subsection, and we've recommended it be removed. In this statement, there's a general statement that there's a great incidence of infections in the elderly population in general. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with the effect of the drug in geriatric patients compared to the effect of the drug in younger adult patients. So again, we want to see what the drug effect is, not concentrate on changes, normal changes, as that results in from increasing age. So I think this is a big take-home message that this is for all labeling. So labeling must be accurate, must not be misleading, must not be promotional. And if there is new information that causes the labeling to be inaccurate, false, or misleading, it must be updated. And this is from not only our statute, as it's also from our regulations. So if we see information, so labeling is not stagnant. If we approve a drug in 2010 and we have additional information about geriatric use that is important and is needed for the safe and effective use of that product in geriatric patients, then that geriatric use subsection must be updated, and potentially other parts of the labeling. Very important when we're revising information in the labeling, whether it's a labeling supplement or an efficacy supplement, we want to make sure that the geriatric use subsection in other parts of the labeling is up to date about the use of the drug in geriatric patients. And this should be done for all approved indications. So let's say, for example, a drug was approved in 1980 and it's got 2 indications. And now it comes in for a new indication. We want to include additional information from that new indication in the geriatric use subsection. So what's the exposure? What are the different, is there sufficient information to detect differences in geriatric patients and younger adult patients? Are the specific risks identified? So look at subsection 8.5, does it need to be updated? So future topics. So as stated, the draft guidance came out 2 months ago. When we finalized the guidance, we're always thinking about, are there new things that we should consider? And one of the things that we're thinking of is that the regulations talk about whether there's sufficient or insufficient data to determine if there are differences in responses. Sometimes it's not clear if there's sufficient data. So should we have proposed language? Should we have recommended language to include in this scenario? Another consideration is that the guidance talks about each part: exposure, sufficient, insufficient information, risks, monitoring, PK, PD information. Should we have a part at the end of the guidance that puts everything together? Okay, now let's turn our attention to part 4. This is part 4 of the webinar. So I'm going to take you through prescription drug labeling resources. So here is our one-stop shop website, Prescription Drug Labeling Resources. To give you a history of this website, it previously was named PLR Requirements for Prescribing Information. And that website, the older name of the website, only talked mainly about physician labeling rule labeling. However, recognizing prescription drug labeling is much broader than the prescribing information. It's about patient labeling and carton container labeling, and recognizing that applicants work on all aspects of labeling, not just the prescribing information. We created a one-stop shop for all prescription drug labeling. And I will show you some of the features of the website. By the way, this website has over 150 labeling resources for the public. So it has information of our rules, our requirements, as well as our guidances. It has approximately 50 guidances that have labeling content, as well as our presentations. It talks about specific sections of the prescribing information or their presentations about broad labeling content. Essentially, if we do a presentation in the public, we put it on the website. We also have safety labeling resources, pregnancy, lactation, and labeling rule resources, sample templates and format tools, and established pharmacological class resources. Specific product labeling resources like generic drugs, biological products included transition products, biosimilar products. We have product quality labeling resources, carton container labeling resources, and patient labeling resources. We also have SPL resources and databases. So before we turn to questions in the audience, I have 2 challenge questions for you. For each of these challenge questions, I'm going to read the question and read each of the answers. And then I'll pause to let you think about the answer. And then finally, I'll walk you through the answer. So for challenge question 1 for parts 3 and 4, which of the following is true about geriatric exposure data in the geriatric use subsection? 1. Must always provide the percentage of patients greater or equal to 65 years of age and older, and the percentage of patients greater or equal to 75 years of age and older. 2. FDA recommends providing the number and percentage of geriatric patients. 3. Alternative age cutoff points may be permitted. 4. The geriatric use subsection should provide exposure databases for each disease rather than pulling data from all diseases. 5. Items 2 and 3. Great. So the answer is 5, items 2 and 3. As stated earlier, we recommend providing not only the number, but the percentage of geriatric patients to give healthcare practitioners more information about geriatric data. As I stated earlier, one could use alternative cutoff points depending upon the data. Potentially, you can use 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 85 and above, if that fits the data, if it's appropriate. Now, going over the other answers, as I stated, there's one situation when one must provide either the percentage of patients 65 of age and older, and either the percentage of patients or the number of patients aged 75 years of age and older. But you can either include percentage or number, and that's only, so that answer is actually not correct. It's not absolute, you have to provide that. And number 4 is incorrect, that it really depends upon the data. Exposure data could be provided for each study, or each disease, or all diseases. So it depends upon the data. Okay, challenge question 2 from parts 3 and 4. Which of the following should not be included in the geriatric use subsection? Number 1, specific risks or safety concerns associated with the use of the drug in geriatric patients. Number 2, specific monitoring in geriatric patients. 3, a summary of PK studies, pharmacokinetic studies in geriatric patients. Number 4, current knowledge about the use of the drug in geriatric patients for all approved indications. Number 5, all of the above should be included in the geriatric use subsection. So the answer is number 5. All of this information should be included in the geriatric use subsection. Great. So this concludes part 4 of the webinar. Thank you for attending this part of the webinar. We're going to break for a few minutes, and then we'll begin the question and answer panel session. Thank you.
Thank you for those great presentations. If you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We have a few questions that have come in. Our first question is to Dr. Brodsky. For a disease that generally occurs in the geriatric age range, is there a reason for having Section 8.5 geriatrics? And in such a situation, isn't the whole label speaking to geriatrics? Additionally, what would be uniquely discussed in this section?
Thanks, Ray. Great question. So in this situation, this is a situation that we didn't primarily discuss in the webinar. It's a situation where disease primarily occurs in geriatric patients and may not occur in younger adult patients. In this situation, the entire labeling contains geriatric use. So subsection 8.5, geriatric use, can make a statement, a general statement, that directs the healthcare practitioner to other parts of the label. A statement could be included such as the drug is indicated in patients 65 years of age and older for an indication, and information on the use is discussed throughout the label. Great question.
Thank you for responding to that question. Our next question goes to Dr. Brodsky. Could you please mention some medicines used only for geriatric patients and not for younger adult patients?
Sure. I think folks may not have been able to hear me the last time, so I could repeat my answer from the last question. So the question previously was about if a product was only approved in geriatric patients and not approved in younger adult patients, how would one construct the labeling? specifically what would be included in subsection 8.5, the geriatric use subsection. As inferred in the question, the information about geriatric use would be included throughout the labeling. Thus, subsection 8.5 could state something like the drug is indicated in patients 65 years of age and older for a certain disease, and the information on the use is discussed throughout the labeling. So, as implied in the question, the information about geriatric use would be throughout the labeling. So, with respect to the second question was, are there any examples for products only approved in geriatric patients, not in younger adults? As I stated earlier, this is not common. One example that comes up is there are certain flu vaccines that are approved only in geriatric patients that are not approved in younger adult patients. Again, very uncommon. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question directed to Dr. Brodsky. For common adverse reactions, patient exposure could be sufficient to detect if there is a difference between adult and geriatric patients. For the same drug for rare adverse reactions, there might not be sufficient patient exposure to determine if there is a different risk in geriatric patients versus adults. How should this be addressed in the label?
That's a very good question, and that's somewhat of a frequent occurrence. So I think you would break it down to each scenario. So if there is sufficient information, sufficient data to look at differences in geriatric patients compared to younger adults, for example, the most common adverse reaction, as mentioned, one would state that. One would include information on that if there were, for example, differences. One would state those differences. And again, if there were insufficient data, well, actually, I'm sorry. Yeah. So if there were insufficient data, yeah. So for that's the general situation. So if there were insufficient data for a rare adverse reaction, one could state, one potentially could be silent, or potentially one could state that there wasn't that there's not enough data to determine a difference between with this important adverse reaction.
Thank you for responding to that question. Our next question is directed to Dr. Singh. Should geriatric patients be stratified by frailty, number of comorbidities, or geriatric conditions in addition to age only?
Thanks so much for the question. We actually addressed this topic of stratification factors in the recently published guidance on inclusion of older adults in cancer clinical trials. And we absolutely agree that age is certainly a heterogeneous process. Aging is a heterogeneous process, and using these arbitrary age cutoffs to determine stratification factors or even inclusion in labeling or clinical trials is not ideal. It is what we have available today. We do think that measures of frailty, which include taking account the comorbidities of patients or concomitant medications, should be evaluated, particularly in oncology clinical trials, but certainly in clinical trials in disease areas which enroll a great amounts of older adults. So I don't think that stratification factors should be limited to age, but I think that until we have a wider and broader adoption of comprehensive or even limited geriatric assessments to better categorize patients, we are relying on this crude measure, which is age.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question directed to Dr. Singh. As geriatric patients may have caregiver involvement, is it possible that resistance, disinterest from caregivers could be a reason for lack of participation of older patients in clinical trials? Caregivers may not want to take this on as it may involve additional doctor's visits, etc., which has a personal impact on them as a caregiver.
Thank you, and that's a great question. I don't think enough attention is paid to the caregiver burden, whether a patient is on a clinical trial or not, actually, but this is of certainly interest when we talk about older adults or adults who may be dependent on a caregiver, or even patients who become more frail, who are not older adults, as their cancer progresses or their disease progresses. I actually think, though, and there have been small studies that show that caregivers are willing to support those that they are caring for if they are interested in participating in a clinical trial. So I think the data on that is mixed. But what I think the broader topic that we could address is how burdensome it is for patients to participate on clinical trials. And I think, and I mentioned in my talk that I think that some of the potential value or benefit that we're seeing from this COVID-19 pandemic is that we are being forced to really hybridize and decentralize clinical trials in a way that keeps patients safe, but on potentially life-saving therapies, and that includes things like doing more clinical trial assessments closer to home, like local labs and local imaging, and hopefully minimizing some of that travel that, whether a patient has a caregiver or not, would, does add burden and perhaps deters patients from participating on clinical trials. So I think it's a great question. I do think, though, that caregivers are interested in helping if they think it's in the best interest of the patient and the patient is willing to participate in the trial. But I think the bigger consideration is how burdensome clinical trial participation is for all patients, and particularly patients who have vulnerabilities or frailty or visual or hearing or any physical impairments. And I really see potential in a post-COVID era in a more decentralized trial process that's less burdensome in clinical trials that work in the best interest of the patient. So thanks again for the question.
Thanks for responding to that question. We have another question for Dr. Singh. What impact have the FDA's OCE's effort made on increasing the evidence base for treating older adults with cancer to date?
Thanks. So I think that the impact that we've made is certainly more awareness on a national and even an international level. And I think one big step was the guidance, the draft guidance that was released in March of this year, which I talked about in my talk and in prior questions. What we heard from industry was that although there were several FDA guidances over several years, which Dr. Brodsky talked about, that addressed the idea of older adults being enrolled in clinical trials, none of these guidances were cancer specific. And what we heard from investigators and industry is they really actually wanted a step-by-step almost tutorial or guidance on what exactly they should be doing and in what phase of development. And so I think we're starting to see more thought being put towards how this data can actually be obtained. We're seeing some loosening or broadening of eligibility criteria of cancer clinical trials, which I think is really important because it can, a lot of these eligibility criteria like organ dysfunction or current or prior malignancies like a low-grade prostate cancer or a skin cancer could artificially exclude many older adults from trials. So I think that's been of some success, and we'd like to see that be more widespread. So I do think that our work around eligibility criteria is making a difference. I think it will take several years for us to then do another analysis of clinical trial enrollment and see if that if the rate of enrollment of older adults has increased.
Thank you for responding to that question. Our next question is for Dr. Crentsil. When a drug's pharmacokinetic parameters such as Cmax and AUC are observed to be higher in geriatric patients than young adult patients, is it enough to include them in labeling without providing additional information?
Thanks, Ray. If pharmacokinetic parameters such as Cmax and AUC are observed to be higher in geriatric patients than younger patients, they should be assessed for whether they are associated with clinically significant effects, especially safety and effectiveness, and the findings of the assessment should be described in labeling. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Our next question is directed to Dr. Brodsky. For common adverse reactions, patient exposure could be sufficient to detect if there is a difference between adult and geriatric patients. For the same drug for rare adverse reactions, there might not be sufficient patient exposure to determine if there is a different risk in geriatric patients versus adults. How should this be addressed in the label?
Hi, Ray. Thank you for the question. I think that question was already answered, so potentially you could take the next question. Thank you.
All right. The next question is again addressed to Dr. Brodsky. Is it a requirement to go back and update current labeling with geriatric data for those products with geriatric indications, or is the draft guidance specific to new approved drugs moving forward?
That's a great question. So in general, there's a requirement to update labeling anytime there's information in the labeling that is outdated, potentially something that's misleading, inaccurate, false, as a general matter. So when labeling, so that would potentially, if an application holder, an applicant notices or observes that there's new information that makes current wording in the labeling that there's current wording in the labeling that's inaccurate, that describes geriatric use information, our expectation is that that application holder would notify the FDA and propose changes to the labeling, specifically geriatric use information, to address that. Now, generally, if there's new information, an application holder can submit a supplement. When new supplements come in, for example, if there is an efficacy supplement with new data about a new use that wasn't approved before, what we recommend is that the application holder analyze those data, looking at geriatric use, geriatric patients versus younger adults, and basically update the geriatric use subsection. If there is nothing new, if there's no new information about geriatric use, if it doesn't change the conditions of use, there's no recommendations to update the geriatric use section. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Looks like we have time for just about 30 seconds left for our last question of the event. This is addressed to Dr. Brodsky. For geriatric subgroups, 75 years and older and 85 years and older, if there is insufficient information to detect differences from adults less than 65 years old, must this be stated in section 8.5, or can the labeling remain silent on these geriatric age subgroups?
Hi, Ray. That's another good question. So actually looking at our regulations are silent on this question. Specifically, the regulations require us to provide information in the geriatric use subsection if there's insufficient information to detect differences in younger adults compared to geriatric patients as we defined as those 65 years of age or older. The regulations are silent about commenting about insufficient information. If there's insufficient information to detect differences in those 75 years of age and older, and those younger than 65 years of age or older. That's something we can potentially address when we finalize the guidance. Very good question.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you to all of our presenters for your very informative and timely talk, and also for responding to the questions that came in. For just a few